earlier. Thank you for the reminder. So it is being recorded, and that is good for you to know. So just a quick few words about both the library and Reversing Falls Sanctuary, in case any of you are not familiar. The Reversing Falls Sanctuary is a Brooksville-based nonprofit that aims to encourage spiritual exploration, advance the arts, and raise ecological awareness and build community. And they do all kinds of really wonderful and exciting things in Brooksville, and really reaching further than that. The library has partnered with them on a few projects in the last couple of years. The library itself serves as an educational and cultural center for the Brooksville community. We are kind of small but mighty, I think, but I'm biased. But we do a lot of good things in town, and we're always really happy to help convene groups of people to share information, and that made us a no-brainer partner for an event like this. The panel is convened today by Climate Action Net, which, in spite of the many crises we are experiencing, strives to keep our climate emergency at the forefront of the community's attention, and has done that in a variety of creative ways in the last few years, and has been pretty effective, I think. So this is just one other way in which that conversation is advancing locally. And Dennis Kiley is going to moderate our conversation today. He is the founder of Eco-Psychology Initiative, where he shares his passion for applying the principles of nature and psychology to foster healing and healthy change for people and the planet. He lives on Mount Desert Island with his wife, Johanna Blackman, and their 2 children. And he's proud to be one of the founders of A Climate to Thrive, which is an organization on MDI working to make the island energy independent by 2030. I've heard Dennis speak a very long time ago in an almost different life, and it's nice to see you again and to be connected in this way. And I'll hand it over to you.
Thank you very much, Brooke, and a big thank you to all of you who are joining us, and especially when it's such a beautiful day and so much that you could be doing to spend your time, that you choose to join us as part of what I think is a really important conversation, and that we're all in it together. I have to share that normally Saturdays, my wife and I hold this pretty devoutly, that it's our date night, and it takes something very significant to shift that. So when Tony initially mentioned the subject matter, I was like, oh, that's amazing. I totally want to be a part of this, and we need that conversation. But I was just ready to send him the email to say, sorry, Tony, it's date night, I can't. And then I saw the panelists, and I was like, oh no, I can't say no to this. I mean, the combination of the subject matter and the people who I knew would be gathering to just share conversation. So I went to my wife, and I wasn't quite sure how she'd respond. And she heard who the panelists were in the subject. She said, oh yeah, you gotta go, you gotta go. So all that is to say, I'm really honored to be able to just try and facilitate a conversation. And my hope is that collectively we get some synergy where the whole is greater than the sum of the parts, and we can draw on the wisdom of these great panelists that we have. But then as a part of the conversations that can happen between that, hopefully we can encompass not only a diversity of knowledge around this really important subject of what should we be teaching young people about climate change, especially with the recent passage of LD 1902, but also to try and get some depth as well. And so the structure of our time together will be to invite each panelist to say a couple of minutes of reflections on the subject at hand. And then based on where we are after that amount of time, I may ask a follow-up question, or I may kind of bank that time later for conversation and input from our audience. Having said that, as excited and honored as I am, I'm also a little daunted because we have 7, 8 people that we know are going to talk for a couple of minutes. We only have an hour and a half. So I think we have an ambitious undertaking to make the most of our time. And so with that said, I'll probably kind of wind down these comments here. And I invite of my panelists the notion that with any extra time that we don't use of, your 5 to 7 minutes, we can save that later for conversation amongst ourselves, as well as hearing from our audience, because I know a lot of you have experience and passion on the subject as well. So just quick reiteration with our time, we're going to invite the panelists to share some words. Maybe I'll ask a follow-up question or not. Then at the end, I'll encourage the panelists to talk amongst themselves for a little bit. Do they have questions or responses to something that was shared? And then open it up to everyone for your input. And like I said, I'm excited for what can come together. And I think what will optimize this is if we just hold respect, where each of us brings our own backgrounds and stories and beliefs and experiences. And I think that diversity can really enhance the conversation, but provided we all do that with respect. So I trust that that can be the case, but ask it of everyone. And so now, without further ado, I'd like to invite Justine Appel, who is a Brooksville math teacher and also runs their school's greenhouse and agricultural program, and long been involved with climate education with young people, to just say a few words about LD 1902 in this context that brings us here today.
Great, thank you, Dennis. Hi, I'm Justine. To sort of set the stage for what we're going to talk about today, I'm going to just summarize for you guys a law that recently passed that actually provides some teeth to this intention that we have to teach about the climate. So it was passed on May 3rd, and it's Maine LD 1902, which is a resolve to establish a pilot program to encourage climate education in Maine public schools. So what that's doing is the Commissioner of Education is going to establish a climate education professional development pilot program. And that will allocate one-time funds for grants to school districts to partner with community-based organizations to create and implement professional development in two areas. One is in teaching the next generation science standards and in interdisciplinary climate education more broadly. So science particularly, but also all of the ways in which climate education can span the subjects that we teach students in public schools. The grants awarded are going to go with priority to underserved school communities, and the commissioner will decide who gets the grants and establish standards and an application process. So that's forthcoming. There will be a non-lapsing fund in the Department of Education that will fund these grants with a starting fund of just over $1 million. And it's also going to create a job for somebody to administer these funds. So for a little bit of background about that, the next generation science standards are the science standards that all Maine public educators have to teach. They span from kindergarten to high school. And I did a Google search, actually. I did a search on the NGSS website, and almost all of those grades have something involving the climate in those science standards. And then what's really exciting about these grants is that professional development obviously is key for implementing anything at the curricular level. But these grants will also help particularly with partnerships with the community, right? So there are a lot of organizations already on our peninsula and in the area doing this work. So this will provide teachers the opportunity to work with those organizations in implementing climate education. So that's my bit about LD 1902. Really excited to see what everyone has to say about it.
Great, thanks, Justine. That was a really wonderful encapsulation of kind of big picture, but also enough nuance that for those of us unfamiliar with the bill and the processes, we hopefully have a little better sense of things. So the one thing I did want to say, just in the convenience of time and trying to be a little more concise, I may not read the panelists' entire bio. Some of you are so accomplished that we could spend our whole time with that. But I am going to just try and give you a little bit of a sense of each panelist before I give them some time. I'm going to start off with Ania Wright. And Ania, though you and I don't know each other that well personally, I've been familiar with you for a while. I used to work at the College of the Atlantic, and I kept hearing about this young leader, Ania Wright, who is standing out. And that's just continued since then. Since she's finished with the College of the Atlantic, she's gone on now to be a youth representative of our Maine Climate Council, and they recently helped to produce the Maine Won't Wait Climate Action Plan. She's a founding member of the Maine Youth Climate Justice Program, as well as the Maine Maine Environmental Education Association, and has familiarity there, and also works currently with the Sierra Club of Maine and closely with working with volunteer teams to support policy goals as part of her political and legislative strategist role. So all that is to say, Ania, thank you for being here. You bring a lot of diverse experiences and knowledge, and we'd love just to hear anything you'd feel like sharing with us.
Thanks so much, Dennis, for that lovely introduction. And Justine, thanks so much for kind of the overview of LD 1902. I had some slides about LD 1902, and I might still share a few of them just to talk a bit more about kind of like the intention behind the interdisciplinary and urgency like factors around the bill. Because Justine, I think you presented about kind of like what the bill will do so well. But I was really lucky enough to be a part of, here, I'm going to share my screen before I keep talking, to be a part of a team of folks that planned the bill, called the Nature-Based Education Consortium Working Group on Climate Education, which is a group of youth and educators across Maine that support organizations and networks who believe all Maine youth should have access to climate education. And so we came together 2 years ago and really started asking the questions of like, what is needed in terms of climate education in Maine? And what do teachers need in order to teach climate education effectively? And I'll make these slides available afterwards. This is a list of all the organizations that were a part of this effort. But really, you know, we focused around a few areas. So focusing around like teachers needing support now, both because of the COVID-19 pandemic, and then also because many teachers have not had access to climate education in their own education, like high school or college. And many teachers teach in areas where climate change is not a broadly accepted topic. And so teachers really need support for their own knowledge to be able to feel comfortable teaching in the areas that they live. Yeah, so that was a big part of the bill. Also, you know, as Dennis mentioned, I am a part of the Maine Climate Council, and we've made, you know, really bold commitments around addressing the climate crisis in Maine. But we really wanted to expand upon the Maine Won't Wait plan to like understanding climate change and the education piece as a key strategy to build hopefulness and like kind of as a strategy within the Maine Won't Wait plan. Also, there's lots of federal fund. I'll skip through this slide quickly, and I will make these slides available. But there's lots of federal funding available right now around climate change, and so wanting to make sure there's an avenue to receive that funding, and meeting the goals that we set within the Maine Won't Wait plan. And then another big piece that we focused around was the importance of workforce development, and recognizing that you know, climate change education is a strong foundation for youth to choose a career that is focused around addressing the climate crisis. You know, for example, a lot of the same skills needed to work on an offshore oil rig are the same skills and technologies needed to work on offshore wind turbines. So making sure that there are those, you know, for lack of a better term, education pipelines for folks to be able to get into those career paths. And I think I'll skip this because Justine already kind of covered this. And yeah, I think Dennis, I'll pass it back to you just in the interest of time and wanting to give my other panelists some time to share as well.
Perfect. Thank you, Ania. Given your familiarity and involvement with this bill, is there anything that feels most important to you that you really hope doesn't get lost and or gets prioritized as, you know, this project moves forward?
Yeah, I mean, I think just climate education as a adaptation and mitigation strategy around climate change is something that I found I learned a lot about when working on this bill, and also I think is something really important to keep reminding our elected officials about. I think, you know, investing in education is kind of a long-term investment, and it's not, you don't see the return on investment very quickly. And I think that makes a lot of politicians kind of wary about investing in it heavily. But really, you know, what has been seen all over the country is in places like Washington State, where they have a very similar program. They've found that you know, students that have had access to climate education not only are more likely to go into climate climate-friendly jobs, but also to make more climate-friendly decisions in their lives as they continue them, and also to communicate that knowledge with their parents and with their loved ones and the people that didn't have access to climate education. I graduated high school in 2015, and I had one section on climate change in biology class. That's also just the science aspect of it. That's not the interdisciplinary aspect of it. So really seeing this as like an investment strategy and a long-term strategy, and a strategy that, is really on par with, investing in offshore wind or solar or public transportation.
That's great. Thank you. It just makes me think of, in psychology, there's a theory of change that says with the more awareness there's more choices available from which change is more likely to happen. And as you talked about access, I was thinking like we're increasing the availability of awareness and access and resources from which a lot more options become available to students and workforces. And so great. Thank you, Ania. Now to shift on, I want to move to Tom Stone, who is a professor and has a lot of experience with bringing climate education and designing courses. He's an associate professor of physics at Husson University, is also their sustainability director, and has been teaching courses like What If They're Right? Individual Responses to Climate Change. And he also wrote an article I was really excited about called How Valuing Time Leads to Deeper Environmental Education, engagement. And so, Tom, welcome. And given kind of the breadth you have around teaching and engaging and forming students and curriculums, anything you'd like to share now to kind of start us off?
Sure. Thank you, Dennis. And I am at home, so if my audio goes, please just let me know. Sometimes it does that. So just throw it in chat. I want to say a couple things about some ideas that I've been developing for 6 or 7 years about how to teach climate change education. But before I do, I want to say 2 brief things about what to teach. Like Ania was just saying, in high schools, unless you take an environmental science course, you're not likely to get a lot of climate change education. You might get a module in bio or something like that. The students I see in the college level that are well-versed in climate change have taken the AP environmental science course. So whatever that course is doing, and I'm not familiar with the outcomes, but they're doing it well. And that might be a place to start when it comes to designing curriculum for high school. The AP environmental science students that I've seen when they get to college can hold a really thoughtful conversation around climate change. And the second thing about what to teach, every school needs a garden. I'm our garden director at Husson too. I teach intro to gardening. Every single school, college, high school, middle school, grade school needs a garden. There is so much to learn there related to climate change, and I will argue you can teach anything in a garden. So when it comes to what to teach, AP Environmental Science is a great place to start for curriculum, and a garden. Everyone needs a garden. So how to teach about climate education, and I'm going to try to, again, keep this brief. I'm a professor. I can talk for hours, ask my students, and and if anyone wants to talk for hours, I'd be glad to chat via email later. So the 3 things that I would focus on or bring, I guess, today, climate education has to be interdisciplinary. The root causes associated with climate change are so interwoven between energy, our culture, women's rights, women's education. I think I said energy already, agriculture. If you look at the UN, Sustainable Development Goals, there's 17 of them. And they're all interwoven. You start pulling on one of those and they're connected to all the other ones. So the education has to be interdisciplinary, in my opinion. And I've been working on a couple models at the college level, and I could share. We wrote a couple of them up, or one of them up as a case study that I'd be glad to share with folks. So like Dennis mentioned, I co-teach a class, What If They're Right? Individual Responses to Climate Change. Of course, yes, by the end of the class, we recognize that individual responses are not enough, but I co-teach the class with a philosopher. So my background is in mathematics, engineering, and science. and I co-teach it, and we truly co-teach the class together. We both lead each day with a philosopher whose background is in art, philosophy, music, film, performance art, very different than my background, social justice. And we have found, and I've taught the class 3 times now with 2 different philosophers, we have found that that model works really, really well. We do teach, we don't, or I should say, we do not teach climate science in the class. We spend 1 day on the science. We have a climatologist from Humane usually come down and answer all of our science questions. The class is about, given this science and given this emergency we're in, how do we respond to it? You know, simply looking away isn't really an option. And so, and when you're 18 or 19, I mean, you know, you're 43, it's a really overwhelming problem, and it's easy maybe to look away. There's a lot of despair and grief that we deal with in that class. But at the end of the day, we give them a place in the classroom where they can try out some responses to climate change. The class is built around 2 big projects, an individual response to climate change, which might involve something like giving up their car for a couple of months, or giving up their phone for a couple of months, or something like that. And the second 2 months is a group project where they focus on a bigger project, community scale or university scale response to climate change project. And so we're giving them a little bit of practice with responding to climate change. But having both of us in there with such diverse backgrounds, each week we have a big topic. It might be agriculture, it might be the climate science, but each week we have a big topic, and we don't necessarily know the path we'll go down. You know, we'll have 2 or 3 main points, but with our backgrounds between us, we can really hit, we can really go down a lot of different places, and we do. Not only that, the students get to see a model of learning. They get to watch me learn from a philosopher, because I don't know much philosophy, and they get to see my philosopher friends learn science and engineering from me. And so they get to see a new model of learning. They don't often get to see their teachers learn in front of them, and we do. They also get to see you know, a civil model for discourse, because sometimes we disagree. So that is very briefly one model we've used as a co-taught course, and we've written that up as a case study that I can post here in the chat. Another interdisciplinary model we've used is through a grant, a Campuses for Environmental Stewardship grant from Maine Campus Compact. Actually, we did this twice. We addressed climate change questions in 4 different classes that were woven together. So in one iteration, it was a math course, a philosophy course, a history course, and an English literature course, where we were looking at the same questions from different perspectives. And with the interdisciplinary, you know, nature of climate change and how hard of a problem it is, that worked out really well to see and hear those 4 different perspectives. We were able to meet each course's individual content outcomes, but while looking at common questions. We had common readings. We had we would guest lecture in all the other courses. I was the math instructor, and I would go bring a little bit of math to English courses and philosophy courses. And that was a different model that we tried twice. And both of these can be logistically difficult. That one's logistically really hard to do. Co-teaching is a little easier logistically to run. But those are just 2 models when it comes to interdisciplinary teaching that we've used at the college level. I've taught the climate change course 3 times, and I've done the Campuses for Environmental Stewardship rotating courses twice, so over the last 6 years, and those have both worked out really well. So 2 more brief things about, you know, how to teach climate change. Number 1 was interdisciplinary. Number 2, get outside. In all of those classes, we find most success the least amount of time we spend in the classroom. And that challenges at the university level what, you know, a typical science course looks like, which might look like a classroom plus a lab or something like that. I mean physically outside. in nature, in the world, interacting with the natural world, interacting with the people in that world. So, giving students that time to get outside, those experiential opportunities, that can be hard from an assessment point of view because you don't necessarily know what the students are going to learn. And so there's a little bit of kind of giving up some control there from an instructor perspective, but we had a lot of success. And of course, getting outside, my students always get in the campus garden. I mean, I do run it, but there's just so much to learn in the garden. So finally, how to teach, my third point is by example. At least at the college level, a lot of times students think the professors are, we're a physics professor, and then we go home and they don't think anything more of us besides us being professors. But we've done a lot of this in our own life. And I really get a lot of traction with my students when I share things that I've tried in my own life. If you're gonna, talk the talk, it's good to walk the walk, and both successes and failures. I've made some good choices with respect to, responding to climate change in my own life, and I've made some bad ones. And I've tried to learn from all of them. And I've got a lot of traction by using my own examples in the class. That might mean data sets from my home's energy use, or how much propane we use, or our hybrid hot water heater, and things like that. It might mean, stuff we've done in the garden. It might mean cultural choices that my wife and I have made with respect to our two boys, no phones and video games and things like that, and how it all connects and ties into climate change. When you bring in your own experience, again, both successes and failures, I think you get a lot of traction. So when it comes to how to teach climate change, I would say it's got to be interdisciplinary, it's got to be outside, and it's got to be by example. And I would gladly talk for hours about any of those, but I am really interested to hear what the other panelists have to say as well. We've got quite the interesting group. So I will turn it back to you, Dennis.
Great. Thank you, Tom. That's really helpful. I mean, you clearly have had your feet on the ground, so to speak, doing this work. And to say I'm a little relieved, I'm teaching an upcoming climate psychology training, and I talk a lot about it's not just the what, but the how. And I think you touched on a lot of really crucial elements there. So I'm relieved to know that there's some overlap. And I also look forward to conversation amongst panelists later about, what really works practically. And, maybe that's a convenient point to transition to Anwen Hudson, a Deer Isle Stonington student, a senior, an Eco Club activist. And I'm curious from you, Anwen, of what have you found does work? What is the need? What is that you're looking for from this upcoming kind of opportunity with the passage of this bill?
Yeah, so can everyone hear me right now? Yeah. I kind of hold an interesting perspective as a student because I'm at the end of my 4 years, so I can kind of reflect on my whole high school career. And really within that time, there wasn't much climate education at all, other than being in the ecology club. And I can't speak for all schools, but in our school, really doing hands-on work, and basically a lot of what Tom said, I agree with, of going outside actually. Like I'm a student who's very tolerant in the classroom, like I can sit for hours at a time, but even and do more hands-on work, and that really engages people the most, students especially the most, I think. Yeah.
Great. Thank you, Anwen. And I hope you'll bring more of that experience and reflections more in the conversation later. But I think it's nice to know that we are coalescing around what Tom is saying, that making it experiential and getting outside is going to be all the more impactful for all people, teachers and students alike. And so someone who has a lot of experience teaching and probably doesn't need much of an introduction, Zoe Weil. Many of you are surely familiar with her, and so wonderful to see you and share this space with you. But Zoe is the co-founder and the president of the Institute for Humane Education, where she's created the first graduate programs offered through Antioch University, linking human rights and environmental sustainability and animal protection, and really fundamentally trying to prepare people to educate others to be solutionaries. And that's not just for students, but teachers alike. And I know my wife and I have often referenced some of the books that Zoe has written, like The World Becomes What We Teach and Most Good, Least Harm. So given the plethora of your background and experience and what you have on the subject here, Zoe, what would you like to share with us?
Thank you, Dennis. And really, it's an honor to be with you all and to hear from some of you who I don't know. I'm taking notes on everything. As I'm thinking about what I can share in 5 to 7 minutes, I always like to go back to stories because there's a good chance you're going to forget the nitty gritty of what we say, although putting our websites and our contact info is going to be really great to continue the conversation. So I want to share some stories with you. So about 10 years ago, I was invited to a school in Connecticut to speak to the 5th and 6th graders. And I asked them what they thought were the biggest problems in the world. And of course, climate change was one of the things they said, but it wasn't the only thing they said. They actually filled up a whiteboard with problems. And these were not problems that they were being taught in school. One boy, 5th or 6th grader, said sex trafficking. So these kids knew about all of these problems, not from what was being taught in school. So then I asked them to raise their hands if they could imagine us solving the problems they listed on the whiteboard. And of the 45 kids in that class, only 5 raised their hands. Only 5 could even imagine us solving these problems. So I realized I had to sort of stop what I was doing and change things up a little bit. So I did a guided visualization with them. And the guided visualization went like this. I asked them to close their eyes and take a few deep breaths, and then to imagine themselves very old at the end of a very long and well-lived life. And I asked them to imagine themselves sitting on a park bench on a beautiful day kind of like today in Maine. And I asked them to imagine that they could hear the birds singing and species had been recovering from extinction, and there hadn't been a war in as long as they could remember, and nobody went to bed hungry because they had no choice, and we had learned to treat each other and other species with respect and compassion. And then I asked them to imagine a child coming up and joining them on the park bench, and imagine that this child had been learning history in school and learning about much darker times when we faced a climate crisis among many other crises. And this child wanted to understand how things changed for the better. And so the child asked all sorts of questions, and they answered these questions through their imagination. And then I asked them to answer this child's final question. The child asks, what role did you play in helping to bring about this better world? And I asked them, how do you want to answer that child's question? So then while their eyes were still closed and they're imagining how they would answer the question, I asked them to raise their hands if now they could imagine us solving the problems that they had listed on that whiteboard. And this time 40 hands went up in the air, completely reversed. It didn't take all that much to restore their sense of hope. What it took was them imagining what they did. It took action. Now, this isn't rocket science, so there are a few quotes I want to share with you. One comes from Joan Baez, the singer-songwriter, who said, "Action is the antidote to despair." And David Orr, who's a professor at Oberlin College, said, "Hope is a verb with its sleeves rolled up." And Greta Thunberg, who doesn't think that we need to focus on instilling hope, but in fact on solving the climate crisis, what she said in her TED Talk was, once we start to act, hope is everywhere. So fast forward, I am invited a few years later to speak to 5th graders when I was in Guadalajara, Mexico for a conference. And I asked those kids if they could imagine us solving the problems that we face, and every hand flew up into the air. So what was different? What was different was what they were being taught. So they were still fifth graders, but their teacher in age appropriate ways was teaching them about environmental problems and engaging them in solving those problems. So the school had put solar panels on the building. They had created a composting system. They had replaced disposable water bottles with refillable water. So they knew problems could be solved because they were solving them. So how does this relate to how we teach? So we have to recognize that young people already know about climate change. If we don't talk about it in school, it doesn't matter. They know about it, and so many are feeling anxious and despairing about their future. So what we need to do is we need to teach them in ways that engage their action in solving the problem. So Dennis introduced me as somebody who educates people to be solutionaries. That's the word that we use. And at the Institute for Humane Education, we have loads of free downloadable resources. We have a solutionary guidebook for educators. We have a version for students called How to Be a Solutionary. We have a short video, Becoming a Solutionary, that goes through this process. So what does this process look like? Well, in a nutshell, it is a 14-step process that includes researching and investigating the causes of problems. So if we're talking about climate change, the many different causes, both root causes, which could be, biological and psychological causes, as well as systemic causes. And I couldn't agree with Tom more about this need for interdisciplinary thinking. And the reason is because when we become systems thinkers, we discover everything is connected. And when everything is connected, it means that when you're studying causes, if you pull on this string, and it's going to be connected to this one. So in order to solve these problems, we have to look at these connections, and then we have to find leverage points for changing systems. And that includes talking to all stakeholders. These problems are problems not because we don't have solutions to them, because there are many solutions. These problems are problems because we are so embedded in these systems that are so entrenched, and we have to find the leverage points for change, which means that we have to talk to many stakeholders. We have to identify solutions. And for young people, it's really good to focus on local solutions, changing what's served in the school cafeteria, getting the school to be net zero. All of these things that can happen on the local level can then be scaled up and shared. And the next thing you know, you have this incredible win. You have this win for kids. They are using literacy, numeracy, science, communication skills for the purpose of solving real world problems that matter to them. They're having success because they're starting locally. They're then able to have a school that has a culture of solving problems. And of course, it's a win for the world. So I think my 7 minutes are up, but I'm happy to continue the conversation, and I will pop my organization's website and my email in the chat. Thank you, Dennis, and everyone.
Thank you, Zoe, yet again, coming through and just so comprehensive there. And I was struck by what you're talking about, and not surprisingly, that we're really trying to create a psychologically sophisticated and empowering system for people. So it's not just what about the climate education, and it's not just that it's interdisciplinary, but it's really engaging people in an emotional as well as mental way that helps them feel really empowered and sees where they have agency, and from which they have models and visions for different ways of a future that they can be a part of. So wonderful. And I'm sure others will have questions and want to riff off what you said, but thank you again. And now moving on to Amanda, forgive me if I don't get your last name correctly, but Amanda Bertana, I think, is a PhD, a professor, an environmental sociologist at Southern Connecticut State University. She's been involved with Climate Action Net in the past. And as someone who's really loving climate psychology and environmental psychology, I was curious to hear more, whether it comes into your talk now, but about environmental sociology and anything you have on the subject that we're at with here today.
Yeah, great. Thank you for that. This has been great. I loved what everybody is saying, and kind of had to cross things off of my list and add things to my list to not be super repetitive, which means, clearly we're onto something. Okay, so I suppose what I was kind of coming here thinking is about, as an environmental sociologist who, and I've also taught in various institutions. I taught at the University of Utah, which, as you know, Utah is not a state that is very open to climate change. And climate change is something that is very much pushed back against in that curriculum specifically to, and I got a lot of pushback from my students. But one thing that the students never pushed back against was air pollution, right? Because air pollution was what they all experienced. And they never quite made those connections though, between climate change and air pollution, right? And so what I'm trying to get at here is with climate education, what I think it's really important to do is to also think about where we're at, contextually speaking, as to the place that we're teaching at as well. And what are the pressing issues in that locale that also will resonate with students there? Because what my class looks like in Utah, or what it did look like in Utah, is very different than what it looks like in Connecticut too, because my students now are facing very different obstacles. But one thing that I have noticed is that as an environmental sociologist, I have students coming into my class because it's an interdisciplinary class, and they don't always necessarily have an interest in the environment. It's an elective for them. And so what I see though, is that I have students who are very much, I am interested in the environment. And then I have students that are all, I'm not interested in the environment at all. And it's my job to convince them why they should be interested in the environment. And that's how I see my role. And so what I noticed though, from what kind of makes it a little bit easier for students when teaching them is, because I'm trying to work backwards here, so bear with me, is that some students come into the class with an appreciation for the environment that was cultivated through understanding what the purpose of the environment served for them, right? And this comes from the interaction with the environment of being outside, as Tom was saying, being able to have those experiences with the community gardens, things like that. I definitely think climate education has to be interdisciplinary. And one of the things though, is that I find that we often have to teach students how to be interdisciplinary and what that means. And part of that also means the ability to be able to work with others. And so when I use that, what I often do with students then in this sense, that can be kind of scaled down to like the lower level teaching too, with like K through 12, is giving them case studies and problems and having them role play these things. And then in doing that, they're able to like build a certain level of empathy and also understand what it means to have to like compromise with others and create things like that. And then the third thing that I think really resonates with students at the end of the course is that's important is for students to understand that they are embedded within the environment, right? And so I always, some of you might have heard this, but when I ask students, I go, how many of you are an environmentalist? And I might have like 2 people shoot up their hand. And then at the end of the day, I'm like, well, how many of you really like your clean water and your clean air? And then they all raise their hands, right? Because what they're recognizing there is that the environment is a necessity for their well-being, right? And that they need it as well. So I think, yeah, I don't want to take up too much time, but those were like the 3 main points that I wanted to get at. So thank you.
Thank you, Amanda. I'm realizing that I think you and I followed each other once in a presentation for a conference that happened at GSA. And I remember writing down a lot of things that you had written, and I'm doing that again now. And what strikes me is a couple of key points I think often get missed is we have to make it personal, and we have to speak to where people care about. And also as part of that is changing the narrative. And I think you really outlined there that someone might not necessarily identify so much as caring about the environment, but when we're able to really expand that awareness of seeing how we're all a part of and influenced by the environment, we can see how much more pertinent it is. And then also to make it local, as Zoe was also saying, of seeing how the way we present it is going to be different in Utah than Connecticut than rural Maine. And so that we can be really adaptable seems so crucial. So thank you for highlighting those points. And now to shift to another student who has a lot of experiencing both engaging climate action, but also being the recipient of high school curriculum and education. I'm talking about Henry Penfold, who is a Deer Isle Stonington senior as well, and Eco Club leader. Welcome, Henry. And anything you'd like to share here about your experiences or what you hope to see moving forward?
Yeah, thank you, Dennis. So like Anwen, I'm another current student. And I think that as a student, it might be helpful if I kind of just outline the shortcomings with the climate education that I experienced. And I think most of it took place in middle school, and the extent of it was really just covering the mechanics of the greenhouse effect. That was really it. We didn't, like as Tom was saying, I think that's an important thing to learn, but there's really no focus on how we can respond to climate change, how we can help bring change. So I think it would be really helpful if there is more focus on political engagement, what students can do to become involved, that sort of thing.
Wonderful. Thank you, Henry. I have a follow-up question. Oh, see, my books that are propping up my iPad are moving here. So I got to, but for you, Henry, I'm curious in the course, or let me put it this way, is that I could imagine if a student is only learning about climate change, about facts and statistics as it relates to climate education, first off, it seems limited, but also I wonder about sometimes the psychological impact and if it might not feel really overwhelming and despairing just to hear how bad things are, as opposed to shifting the focus either to action or different ways of presenting it that might feel more effective.
Well, yeah, I would actually say it was probably the opposite, in that I don't think the immediacy or the severity of the problems that climate change is creating were really impressed on us, which isn't really a good thing either. But yeah, I would say they were, yeah. It wasn't really overwhelming, but it wasn't very productive either.
Yeah. What do you find productive when you're engaging your fellow peers on the issue, and especially those maybe that aren't as informed or passionate about the subject?
I think just like discussing what we can do, discussing political engagement. I think at this point, more and more people are understanding the severity of the problem and how immediate it is. So yeah, I think just discussing what we can do to become involved, I think has been good.
Yeah, wonderful. Well, thank you about that. I think it's also about highlighting people like yourself and others who are doing that work that can make it relatable, and for people then to feel like, oh yeah, look at Henry and what he's doing, and I want to do it as well, or Anwen and others. So thank you for that. We'll surely want to hear from you more later, but now moving on to our final panelist, who I'm sure many of you also know, Robert Shetterly. Rob, thank you for being a part of this. And I imagine you've seen the arc of climate involvement for a while, but for those who aren't familiar with Rob's work, he's the director of the Americans Who Tell the Truth project, and that involves both portraits and education. He's got a book forthcoming this summer called Earth Justice. And having been passionate about this subject and both profiling others and yourself personally and following it for a while, I'm curious, what stands out from you about where we've been and where we are and where we need to go? You're on mute.
Is that okay? Thank you. Thanks, Dennis. Thanks to all of you. I'm really impressed with what everybody's saying. I mean, and what Americans Who Tell the Truth does is a kind of a corollary to many of the other things that have already been talked about. I'll just try to say a couple of things that are maybe slightly different. In the educational work, we do try to begin with a kind of a basic philosophy of that hasn't really been talked about. I mean, Zoe did in a way, but it's we live in a system. We live in a system of nature, and kids are not really taught that, I thought what nature's laws are and how important it is to try to live in harmony with them and to build all the other systems in relationship to that. I mean, when we talk about intersectionality, we've got to really begin there. I mean, that what we're really, you know, involved with is a system that is, you know, giving us life and making it possible for us to survive on this planet, and that we have been actively, you know, taking away our own options because of the way we've treated and responded to nature. And so understanding what that system is and how we have to live in relationship to it is the place that one begins, I think. And, you know, with Americans to Tell the Truth, you know, I've been for over 20 years painting portraits of people on a whole variety of political and philosophic and, environmental issues, just as eclectic as could possibly be. But many of them are about our relationship to the environment and how we have struggled in that relationship. I think what what Henry was talking about is wanting examples, and what Zoe was talking about telling stories. We try to do both of those things. I painted many young people in particular who have in communal ways or in political ways or in ways of protest and have stood out and actually changed things. People like Tim DeChristopher, who was, as a young person, when he saw what was happening to the land in southern Utah, interrupted a meeting where the land was being leased to oil and gas companies, and started bidding himself until he had spent millions and millions of dollars and had not a penny in his pocket, to buy this stuff. But his action, although it ended up him going to jail for 2 years, saved that land and stopped the auction, stopped the land being leased to these companies. People like Kelsey Juliana, who's represented by our Children's Trust. And this is, very important for young people to know that, other young people are in the process around the country of suing state governments and suing the national government, to insist through legal means that the states or the national government live up to what we would call the public trust doctrine, that their first responsibility is not just, to care for people or provide this service or that service, but actually to provide in the long term an environment in which we can continue to live sustainably and healthily. And that that young people can actually be the active agents to force governments to do that work, which is their primary responsibility. And so, we brought Kelsey Juliana here a couple of times. We've done a lot of work with her to show that, that big case of Juliana versus US, how important that is and how it can be modeled by other people. Recently, I painted a portrait of a girl named Jasa Hunter Mellers, who is a 10-year-old living in a poor Black section of Bridgeport, Connecticut, which was, like the epitome of environmental racism. All these terrible plants were put in that area, coal-fired power plant, waste disposal plant, all kinds of other manufacturing, the plants that would never show up in well-to-do white neighborhoods. And she was suffering, as many of her friends were suffering, from diseases that were caused by the toxins being spewed from these plants. And so as a 10-year-old, she became the face of the group that was opposing those plants and was trying to have them removed. And as a 10-year-old, she, instigated the removal of the coal-fired power plant in Bridgeport. That is the kind of example that we'd like to do with, Americans Tell the Truth, to show that young people of really any age engaging with this process can cause some surprising changes to happen, and then model that change for adults. What we like to say about Americans Who Tell the Truth is that the person with the courage to confront the issue becomes the teacher for everyone else, whatever age that person is, that person becomes the teacher. And that, we base our work in schools in Maine around the idea of the memory of Samantha Smith, who was a young girl in the 1980s, who was very disturbed about the Cold War and the possibility of nuclear annihilation, who wrote a letter. And, to Yuri Andropov, the Soviet premier of the time, asking why he wanted to blow up the world. That step is what we try to, in our Samantha Smith challenge, get kids, middle school kids, that's our primary audience, to be inspired by, is that, taking an initial step about a thing that you care most about, even if you begin in a place of fear, doing something inevitably results in other opportunities. You do something, it's like going up a stairway. You take a step, suddenly another step appears. And in Samantha's case, the next step was being invited to the Soviet Union to find out for herself whether Russians, this kind of sounds ironic to talk about today, but wanted war or peace, and then having the courage to take that second step, which then led to a whole host of other things, where Samantha then becomes, at 11, a teacher to adults about how to think about making peace in the world. So, this is, we find that in our work at schools is not unlike Zoe's in a way. Working with young people, and we didn't come up with the term solutionaries, but we use it. Thank you, Zoe, because that's what we're aiming to get with kids. And often it's very corrective. One of the, just tell you one other story about being in a school where when we first arrived, we asked kids what they're concerned about. And as Zoe says, what you find out is that kids know a lot about climate. That's one of their major fears. And I remember being told by a group of kids in a school in Old Town that their way of answering this problem and what they were going to do was terraforming. I had no idea what terraforming was, but they explained it to me that, Elon Musk and all these other rich guys were going to make it possible to live on other planets. And I said, oh, you think they're going to take everybody there? Oh, sure, they're going to take millions of people. It's all, that's the answer to this problem, And that's, when you don't have education, climate education in schools, and also don't teach the possibilities of action, kids will go to ideas like that as a possible solution, the craziness of that. What we like to do is teach as broad a spectrum as possible about the ramifications of climate, because you never know where a particular kid is going to want to connect with their skills and their imagination, whether it's about the oceans or habitat loss or the air, the water, the species, whatever it is. Kids will want to find a place where they can be, most fully and passionately engaged and do that work. And that's what we try to expedite ourselves. Thank you.
Thank you, Rob, for being one of the storytellers that creates new narratives of what is happening and what is possible, but also helps to debunk some of the stories and narratives that are really limiting and misguiding and just cause more problems than we're in. And, one of the things you touched on rings a personal bell for me is this reminder of the larger story that we are a part of, that nature is a part of us and we are a part of nature, and that the more we live harmoniously and aligned with those principles, and at the Eco-Psychology Initiative, we call it psychological biomimicry, but the more that we are living aligned in that way, the more that not only we thrive as individuals and communities, but also that our impact in the world is much more harmonious and can ripple out. So anyway, I could go on, but I've talked enough, and I would love to hear from the panelists to talk amongst yourselves, either to feed off and riff on something that was said or to ask a follow-up question, et cetera. And then thereafter, for the rest of you, I'd love to get your inputs, either that you can put into the chat or ask later. But for the time being, just to draw on the wisdom that we have here with the panelists and hear what they want to say amongst themselves.
I had a question for Anwen and for who's the
Henry.
So I understand that there wasn't really a political component, that action component. Was there any action component in terms of learning about climate change? And the political component is one direction. There's so many different directions one can go in terms of action. Was there any?
For the classes that I had taken in my time, no, not at all. And I think really it's a shame because when you start focusing on the solutions and how to get kids involved in terms of the solutions and then do project-based learning off of that, that's like really how you get kids involved. And I think that students start to zone out, like they don't want to hear about it anymore when they let it sit heavy on their chest. But I mean, Miss Pease, my art teacher who's in this call right now, I know she works a lot on that. But but in my time, no, there wasn't much of that. Yeah.
Yeah, I feel like if there was anything, it was just like use a metal water bottle, like that sort of thing. Certainly no like how to become politically engaged or anything like that.
Can I say something? I just want to, this is so important. I mean, I think, equally important to teaching the, what we are in relationship to nature, is to teach, and really struggle to understand where we went wrong. The systems we've built that are, working against us at this point. How did we get there? And then, for instance, why is it, underlying all these problems, it's not like leaders of the world and governments do not know what these problems are or how serious they are. They can't fix them. They're not fixing them. They're failing. They've really failed us. And so, teaching, political answers and how one has to struggle politically to force governments to act in the way that's going to, make a difference in the future of this planet is exceedingly important. We do all these community things, which are really great in terms of local action and local resilience. But in terms of, restructuring the systems by which we have to live and will live in the future or not live, is really, really important. So teaching that, where went wrong, why has our own economy become the enemy of survival on this planet, and why can't governments answer that is really, really important, I think.
I just want to add on to that, Rob, that this is why this panel and why so much of the work that so many of us are doing is so critical, because the education system is the root system underlying all the other societal systems. So in order to change all those different societal systems and make them in harmony with the natural system, we have to start with the educational system. It isn't, it often doesn't seem as sexy as, working on this piece of legislation or that, which we have to do as well. But if we fail to change the underlying system that underlies everything else, then we're just going to put out fires forever, literally and figuratively, metaphorically.
Kind of going off of what you were just saying too, Rob, is that I think one of the things that we often overlook is that there's a value system of society that is independent of like individuals. And we often we don't teach students or teach the youth about these like value systems that is like, the focus on economic growth, right? Over like the health and well-being of our society. Right. And so we kind of, oftentimes it's like, I remind people that it's like, or students specifically, that the value systems that we have in place in society they're so embedded in our society that we overlook where they came from. And it's important to remind people as to like, well, why do we think that way? Right? Like, why do we think that this kind of consumer culture is what's going to make you happy? Like, what are these other things in place that will make you happy?
And then who profits from having you think that the first one makes you happy?
Right. So can I ask a question just going off of that? if, you know, like Zoe mentioned, a lot of solutions are out there, but we're having a hard time implementing them because of some of these inherent barriers in place of our own value systems that we've created, right? So going back to the education piece and early childhood all the way to high school, I guess, do you find that like teaching or like reshaping value systems to be just as important as teaching, right, as Tom was mentioning, the qualitative and the quantitative of climate change, the interdisciplinary nature? How do we anticipate the barriers that have kept adult society from implementing some of these like really clear solutions?
That's such a good question. I'll try and answer it, and then I'm sure all my co-panelists have ideas too, but I mean, I think that's a critical component of it, right? You know, when you think about the roots of the climate crisis and like why we are here today, what's caused the climate crisis that we're in, it's, you know, the capitalist system that tells us that we need to continue to consume more and more and more. And it's the colonialism that has, you know, ruined our relationship with the land that we're a part of. You know, it's the racism and sexism that has led to certain parts of the population having all of the power and not letting and causing inequalities in how climate change is affecting communities. And so it's absolutely critical. And I think like one conversation that I actually had this weekend with a friend that I feel like encapsulates it a little bit is, you know, he was talking about how Maine can't look at anything except for electric vehicles because no one wants to take public transportation in Maine because everyone loves their cars. And we were talking about how, well, yeah, but like I live in Bar Harbor, I can't get off the island without a car. Like I've never known any other reality. And so therefore I've built a relationship with my car. But you know, if we change those systems and change the relationships that folks have and make those different opportunities accessible to people, that changes the system. If I could get to Portland to visit my mom on a train faster than I could get to her in my car and spend less money, like that's what I would do. And so I think enabling people to be able to change those perspectives is a huge part.
I just say,
sorry, Rob.
well, I just want to say one thing in response to Justine is I think it's very important that we do teach those values and also show how they can change. And, you know, by example, I mean, for instance, I love to tell the story along with show the portrait of Aldo Leopold and talk about, you know, I'm sure a lot of you read the Sand County Almanac. And there's that moment in there where he and a bunch of other, you know, rangers shoot a pack of wolves. Because they think that predators are bad and it will also raise the income for deer hunters. And then they study, or he studies, what happens to the mountain that the wolves live on because they've killed the wolves. And that changed his value system when he realized that how integrated they were. The wolves were integrated into the health, not only of the mountain, but the deer and everything that lived on that mountain. And so, you know, often a story like that, which I think really almost any kid can understand, you know, what he did, why he did it, and what he thought, and then how it changed, is a great way, you know, through those kinds of stories. And, you know, his story, you know, Rachel Carson's story, all these stories are, you know, really important and inspiring, you know, for the teaching of values and how they can change.
I want to jump. Oh, sorry. Go ahead.
Oh, no, it's, I should put my hand up or something. So Justine, we, in my class, we end up putting the question directly to our students, and we ask them, what do you value? You know, within a month or two of the course, we always end up coming to that fundamental question, what do you value? And then a follow-on is, what ways that you live your life don't match with what you value, and why do you do that? And I think the word we've been circling here, and it's a hard one, especially for us as Americans to use, is relinquishment. Rob was talking about these cultural systems, these economic and social systems we have. The question we then ask after what do you value is what should we give up? What should we should, give back? Should we be able to get off? I don't want to pick on you, Ania, but should we be able to get off the island any day? Or should I be able to hop on an airplane and, be in California tomorrow? I mean, do those, what things that we do that we've developed over the last, say 300 years, what should we maybe stop doing? And that is especially, I think, for us in the United States, we are accustomed to being told that more equals better. And we know that's not the case. We know if we continue down that path, we'll destroy the planet. And but that's a hard question. What do we give up? There's certain things I think certainly we should keep. We've had lots of medical progress, and that has brought lots of comfort to people. But there's lots of things that are of convenience and that maybe don't enrich our lives in the way we think they do. And so those are two of the most, I guess, challenging questions we put to our students. What do you value? And how does your life match up to your values? And then what should we relinquish? And that word relinquish is a very specific one. Jem Bendel has developed what he calls a deep adaptation framework. And it's a counterpoint to the triple bottom line, people, profit, planet. It's a different way to think about sustainability. So I can put that in the chat, but relinquishment is one of the questions that he asks and that we also ask our students. It's a tough one. It's a hard one.
Boy, thank you for sharing that, Tom. We do something similar, asking what do you think are the best qualities of human beings, which Justine, I think, overlaps a little bit with values. And people say the same things over and over. They say compassion and courage and honesty and trustworthiness and integrity and generosity. And no one ever says greed and destruction and violence and hatred. Nobody ever says those things. I think what's so tough, and I appreciate this concept of relinquishment. I've sometimes used the word restraint, is that what I've discovered in now for almost 4 decades of being a humane educator and teaching about environmental and human rights and animal protection issues is that the majority of people aren't willing to make personal sacrifices. They're not, that most people will allow their desires to eclipse their values. Not everybody, but most people, even when they hear about something. And so part of becoming focused on educating solutionaries is this recognition of this psychological reality and helping people to work, not to terraform, oh my goodness, Rob, but to think about how we can change existing systems so that people can, quote unquote, have their cake and eat it too, to the degree that we can. Now, I'm all for helping people to fall in love with nature, go outside, care enough to want to make personal changes. And yet, I'll just give you one example. So I'm vegan. I've been vegan for 33 years, and I do that for animals and for the environment. And in teaching about factory farming and, the despoiling of our ecosystems through animal agriculture, and people hear these horrible things and don't want to change that. What's really shifting is the system. Like, if we can change the system so that we no longer have factory farming, it's just not a system anymore. And if people want to still eat meat, they can find it in either the small scale way that sometimes happens in humane ways and sustainable ways, or, and I know this may sound controversial, they can look toward the cultivated meat movement, which is growing cells and doing it in sustainable ways without antibiotics, without pesticides, without hormones. For those people who want to eat meat and dairy and sea animals, that way will be more sustainable, and they will still be able to, quote unquote, have their cake and eat it too. It won't be my way, but I still think that unfortunately, people resist giving up the things that they want and like.
Yeah.
And I know that opened up a whole can of worms.
Well, that's a good word for it. So not the whole can of worms, but opening up, because I want to open up the conversation to non-panelists, to ask your questions, to share your ideas. You've all been very patient, and I've had a chance to talk a lot, and I have tons of things coming up, so I can imagine others might as well. So just now, to open it up to anyone who would like to contribute to this conversation, feel free to unmute yourself unless you want to raise your hand or input the question into the chat. Go ahead, Tony.
I would just like to offer a prompt for Henry, in that, like, I've been involved with the ecology club at Deer Isle, Stonington High School, with Cynthia Pease as the faculty person for the club. And I know that when I first entered, there was a lot of talk about, we have to get solar, we have to get solar. And I think, Henry, it would be great if you told the story of how that played out over the last year or so.
Yeah, so when we started the club, it was just one of our first goals was to get solar for the schools. It just seemed like a really kind of concrete step we could take. And I think the biggest revelation from that whole process was just how easy it was to do. It was really just like, did a minimal amount of research, wrote a proposal, presented it, and it was over. It was really short and painless. But yeah, it wouldn't have happened without Tony there to mentor us through doing it. So I think it's a really solid example of how important it is to have people in the schools that kind of help us bring change, help us learn how to do this.
I have a question. It was so exciting to hear about all the money that's being allocated to public school education about climate change. And somebody touched on how some communities in some parts of Maine are not nearly as receptive. And I'm wondering what people's thoughts are as a way to respond when local people say climate change is a hoax, you shouldn't be allowed to teach this, just like all the LGBTQ stuff. I mean, I have a feeling that there's going to be kind of a backlash, and that, you know, people are going to be saying, oh, we're trying to brainwash our children. So I'm just wondering about strategies to deal with that.
So that's a great question. This is Tom. I'm in Bangor at Husson now, but I'm originally from Central Maine. So I grew up in Newport, went to schools in Corinna. So I'm from deep in, Maine 2nd District, and where you run into a lot of climate change denial and things like that. And I think it's really important to meet people where they're at and find something that resonates with them. One of my favorite graphs to pull up is the ice out dates. There's a Vermont lake that's tracked like when ice is out for the last couple hundred years, and it's really clear, from that, the changes that are happening. So if I'm talking to someone who I know is, into ice fishing or fishing, I'll talk about that. If I'm talking to someone who's more into hunting, then we'll talk about, ticks moving north or things like that. So I try to find where they're at and to meet them there. Others might have some other suggestions too.
May I tell a little story? One of our schools we work at is in Pittsfield, where it's a pretty conservative-minded community. But the teachers we worked with in the school were very much in favor of the kids wanted to do a project around climate. And so they divided up all the kids into small groups, and they each had a topic about sea level rise or habitat destruction or species extinction, all these different things. and each group of kids produced a little video about their project. And then they worked with the local movie theater and invited all the townspeople, including the parents, in for the kids to then introduce their videos and talk about what they had learned. And it was amazing what happened in that community, because here were the teachers, I mean, the kids teaching their own parents about the truth of what was going on. And it was a means for, not some other, academic outsider to come in and say, hey, this is what, is happening because of climate change, and you guys are all, Neanderthals. Actually, Neanderthals, I'm sure, understood this better than most of us today. But, having the kids teach the parents was a great mechanism for confronting that problem. And so I think that's, one of the things that we can do with by educating children is because they go home then and teach the parents.
I can add one more thing. I like to use the and model, where a lot of the solutions to climate change are also good for other things in society, whether it be the economy or the community. Like, I know Maine has been good. One of the things that I miss the most about Maine is the amazing thrift stores, right? And it's also, but that's also something that is very, that is better for like the waste and in society as well, and it's also a solution to climate change as well, or one solution too.
Yeah, thanks for that, Amanda. I'm struck by what both you and Tom are saying. We talk a lot about in our programs of, meeting people where there are, and this both and lens. And I think fundamentally, to make an emotional connection with people is so valued, that people protect and take care of what they love and what they appreciate. And so when we are able to adapt what our audience, and I think that starts with a humility to not like self-righteous or these are all the answers, but what do you care about? And how can we then tie that in? I think it's going to be much more effective. And in so doing, we realize that climate action is good for the economy. It's good for global geopolitical security. It's good for all these different factors. It's good for hunting and outdoor activities. And all of a sudden, we realize that, as so many have said, that it ties in to everything. And I guess I also want to just jump in and ask a practical question of those who might know more, is that does this bill allow for some discretion to incorporate, for lack of a better word, some of the psychological components? I know, Justine, you were talking about like a heavy emphasis on science and the collaboration, but is there leeway for educators to incorporate, talking about value systems and identities and, et cetera, some of these other pieces, or is it going to be more limited?
That's a really good question. I read the bill, the interdisciplinary climate education piece. I feel like it was really good that they threw that in, and not just focusing on science standards we have to teach, because social emotional education is not a part of our science standards, nor a lot of other things. The way that it's written, I would say it probably depends on who our commissioner of education is, but that really skilled grant writers can usually incorporate, right, like the wording, and usually have the skills to build like a strong grant that can encompass a bunch of things. So I feel really hopeful looking at it and just having some experience helping administrators write grants in the past, that those things can be included.
Actually, I wanted to say that I teach in the University of Maine system. Oh, you can, yeah, you can hear me. And I do teach social and emotional skills for educators. And what I'm finding is that they're very interested, and what they need is support, and they need courses and professional development. And then they know how to bring it into their students, and they know the developmental stages of their students and where and how to bring it in. So what I think is needed is a lot of support for the educators, and support for, I think people are interested. They're just waiting. They're waiting for somehow to plug in, so to speak.
I have a question if nobody else does. First of all, I have a million questions, and this is so rich, and I don't even know. I'm going to direct my question at anyone who has feedback, because frankly, I'd like to hear from everyone, but that's probably complicated. One thing that interests me in this subject, thinking about is, of course, and I know everyone has spoken to this regarding the importance of interdisciplinary teaching of climate change. But another thing that I understand is so difficult and tricky about climate change is not only is it sort of interdisciplinary, but it's really like that there's such discrepancies between where both like temporal and geographic. So like where the responsibility, the discrepancy between who's responsible and who gets impacted, and what we're experiencing now actually happened, sort of like sun damage, it shows up 30, 50 years later. And I think that is from what I understand, that's a very tricky part to explain to anyone, myself, everyone has a trouble with that, but particularly for young people, I guess this is what my question is, living with that sort of uncertainty where you may feel empowered and you may have the tools and action, but seeing the results is much harder with climate change. So while there's like a recognition of sort of like small victories that maybe occur locally, to see that regardless you have these, and I guess this is also where the civic component comes in, is that, what we really need to be doing is pushing these guys at the top. How sort of you create that resilience and recognition of those systems. I know that I think it's called this like socio-scientific issues teaching, where you sort of teach young people about complex systems and particularly nonlinear systems, so that to prepare them not for like disappointment, but just for that inability to necessarily track your progress. Sorry if that was a ramble, but if anyone has a reaction to that, that's what I'm interested in.
I'll jump in quickly, Sarah. It's such an important question because climate change is one of those problems that is just getting worse, and it's going to continue to get worse, even if we address it in the most perfect ways, whereas so many other problems have gotten better over time. Like even when we take two steps, we take one step back after two steps forward, we can see progress. But this is one that's really tough. And what I try to do is to remind students of the many, many other issues where we have made really significant progress, to keep that sense of hope and motivation and mission alive, that because it's a really tough one with climate change.
If I can add to that was so good. And I really like that you use the word uncertainty too, because the uncertainty of everything is what kind of creates so much like kind of fear almost, right? Of like, what are we stepping into? We don't necessarily know. And for like the younger people, they don't know what their future is going to look like, right? Because they just know that it's going to be different than what it is, and most likely more difficult. But I totally agree with Zoe, and also adding to that, if thinking of even within the environmental movement, that there have been periods of successes, but highlighting too that longevity of like, this has taken 30 years. And so when we're thinking about social change isn't always necessarily even within like our lifetimes. But social change is just something that takes a really long time in general.
Yeah, well said, Amanda. I just want to be conscientious of time and holding this framework. I think a lot of us could continue to riff about this forever. I might just offer one other thought, Sarah, is that I think it's going to be really critically important as we educate around climate change that we're also talking about the psychological impacts, and that we're doing what we can to promote psychological resilience and well-being as part of this, so that we can sustain the uncertainty and the setbacks, et cetera. And so I hope that'll be part of the curriculum. But just to maybe invite one final question, anyone who'd like to offer us something to guide us moving forward, or maybe it's just miscellaneous, but not to abruptly bring us to the end, if anyone has something they'd like to offer here, or it could be a comment from one of the panelists. Yeah, Annie? You're on mute.
Yes, thank you. What was just talked about brings really into sharp focus the need for the interdisciplinary approach, because looking at biography and history is an excellent way to teach children who haven't experienced other eras and other struggles to see how long it took, how much effort it took, and that it and the courage that people have manifested in the racial struggle and other situations over time. And I think that brings the humanity and heart and the caring aspect that's so needed when we're dealing with really difficult issues like this and complex issues like this.
That's a wonderful final reflection there. Thank you, Annie. And speaking of thank yous, thank you to everyone, the panelists and the audience members alike. I remain just as honored and excited about being a part of this as I did at the beginning. And I hope all of us feel in some way inspired to continue with this moving forward, thinking about ways in our communities that we can get involved. And for me, it's to take heart knowing that just in our communities here, there's a lot of people already doing great work, and there's wonderful resources out there. And so I guess I just invite us all to really stay engaged and be part of these conversations and doing our part. And so thank you for joining me in this. It's been just a really nourishing conversation, and I look forward to sharing more with you in the future.
Thanks, everyone.
Thanks, everybody.
Thank you, everybody.
Yeah, thank you. Thanks, Tony and Ann, for putting it together.
Nice work.
Yeah.
Nice work.
Thank you.